Good morning, everyone. We're about to start our plenary session now, and it has been a very nice, relaxing morning break, ready for our stimulating speakers in this next session. My name is Jo Baxter. I'm on the WFAD board and also Executive Officer Drug Free Australia. Very, very pleased to be here today and yesterday, and of course tomorrow. This session brings to you three eminent speakers, and I'd first of all like to do a couple of housekeeping things so that at the end I can also remind you, because these are important. The first one is that there is a dinner tonight for us all, and we're all invited to come back here and to look at the entrance, the appropriate entrance to go in. It's not quite the same one as the conference. Apparently we follow the signs, and there'll be a beautiful function with entertainment and food and a celebration of the Niels Bohr Award. So please keep that in mind. 7 p.m. tonight. Come a little bit beforehand just to really enjoy socialising, and it will be a nice time for us to get together. The second thing that I want you to keep at the back of your mind is our organisation, World Federation Against Drugs, that you're learning more and more about, many of whom are already members. We would like to invite further membership. It is no cost, because individuals can join and organisations can join. All you need to do is to go to the website. If you support the principles that you're finding here and would like to maintain the networks that you're making, joining as a WFAD, World Federation Against Drugs member, is as easy as pressing your computer button to that website. And so I'll remind you of those things later, but I just want you to go away with those two things in mind: dinner tonight and possible membership of this wonderful organisation and network. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce to you our first speaker, Kiran Bedi. Kiran Bedi has made herself one of India's most famous women because of involvement in social activities and police work. She received the Woman of the Year award in 1981 for her lifelong commitment to equality and justice. Bedi is the founder of numerous Indian NGOs concerning crime prevention, as well as drug abuse prevention and child welfare. Bedi holds a BA in English and an MA in political science, as well as an honorary degree of Doctor of Law in recognition of her humanitarian approach to prison reforms and policing. Known for her rhetorical skills and motivational speeches. There is a lot more that we can tell you about Kiran, but I think we need to hear her message today, and you can find more information on our website and talk to her, of course, over lunch as well. Welcome.
Good morning, and absolutely delighted to be here, all the way from New Delhi. The seed was sown many, many months ago by my friend Sween Olof Carlson. Thank you, Seed, for he came all the way to my office in Delhi and inspired me to be here this morning. I see absolute inspiration so far. The two speakers I heard this morning were just wonderful. I learned a lot. I found both the speakers from Brazil and from America absolutely to the point and absolutely relevant for each one of us. Thank you for educating us. I take home some very good, right ideas from both of you. How many minutes do I get? It's 11:15 by my clock. 20 minutes, thank you. Just remind me when it's last 2 minutes. Fine. Before I put my presentation in context, which I have a little slides for you, they are very, very archival. And therefore you see something black and white as old as this. This newspaper report goes back to 1986. You might just say, how did you preserve it? Because I preserve everything I love. I preserve everything I love doing. And therefore, these are some of those things I loved doing, which is 35 years of Indian policing. I became the first woman in my country to join the officer ranks of the Indian Police Service in 1972. I retired 2 years ago voluntarily because I wanted to now move on to higher purpose, even higher purpose in my life, and I took out to do something more exciting, which I'll come back to you a little later. But having served 35 years of Indian policing, I'm going to share with you what I saw and what I did with it, without having the kind of experience and resources which you had, the kind of academic understanding or research you put in, without the policies which the Brazilian colleague of mine had. How did I do as an individual who had no money, who had no budget? Because as a law enforcer, an Indian policewoman or officer would have meant, well, arrest, detect, prosecute, punish. That's it. For them, that time when I joined the service, policing was considered as a power to arrest, power to detect, and power to punish, and even power to harass, and power to handcuff. Whereas when I entered, it was not that I wanted to be different, but I think nature does make certain differences, gender differences and individual differences in our lives. I joined the service in 1972 at the top of my academic career, not knowing I was going to be the first woman, but I wanted to work with the government. I was a tennis champion during my time as a student. I was an Asian tennis champion, playing a lot of tournaments. I was there to serve. I wanted to work with the government because in the 70s, government meant power to serve. Therefore, I volunteered to sat for the Indian Police Service examination, where millions sit. You know, India is all about millions. And from the millions, I became that one who, by my own merit. There was no corruption in that examination, but when I joined, I was given options to think different, think of other jobs I qualified, but I wanted to work in the police. Why? Because for me, the policing stood for the power to correct, power to reform, and power to get things done. That's how I looked at it as a woman, as growing up as a teenager, because I saw the negative side of policing, and I thought that whatever has a negative side also has a positive side. So why can't I be a good cop? If somebody could be a bad cop, I could be the good cop and do all the good things. So that is what attracted me, and I told my parents, I'm going to be a cop one day. So sat through. Now, why I'm saying this is because you do in your job what your mission statement is. You do whatever you do by what you're there for. So for me, the policing, as I said, was power to correct, and that is how this context, where I've been invited to your forum, falls in perspective. So I'm going to show you, as I worked through crime prevention in my crime detection, I've identified in the 1980s, India had become a transit country where drugs were transiting from Afghanistan, Iran route, now getting seeped. It was transiting through India, was becoming a transit route to rest of the world. And then over a period, because of the Russian blockade from a particular portion, so suddenly the drugs from the best of the heroin from Afghanistan and Iran now started to flow through Indian ports of Mumbai and airports of Delhi, and then go to the western and Australian routes. And that is a time when India started to become a drug abusing country. Earlier it was not an abusing country, it was an opium growing country, more for medicinal purposes. It was an opium taking country, not heroin, not cocaine. Cocaine and crack is still in bits at the moment. But I was trying to tell you, when I was heading at that time, I realized two important things. Crime and drugs now were overwhelming. How do I check crime when I can't check drugs? How many times will I put people? There were no treatment centers because it was a problem which had just happened. Just one treatment center run by the community for the entire city of Delhi. So as a police chief of that city of Delhi, of a district of Delhi, I have drug addicts committing robberies, rapes, burglaries, violence, domestic violence, and here I am wanting to prevent crime. So I put in place systems, holistic systems. So here is a case study of no money, but as individual determination, how I put in a holistic system at that time, somehow this still that's not still a part of the policy, but it's more of an individual effort, but working through the government system, where thousands of cops became and people became a part of that community effort in crime prevention. By the way, the same effort got recognized later, but I'll come to that little suspense little later. So I saw that crime and drugs were very related, as I believed in the power of crime prevention. I found I can't prevent unless I treat. So as a police officer, when I saw this related, I looked into areas just as my Brazil friend. Where are the breeding places? And here were the breeding places. Drugs in slums, big money. Just as my Brazil friend said, there was a segment, there was an area where suddenly you find drugs. I identified those places, put a policing crime prevention system of a beat foot patrol system around the clock, partnering with the community to identify drug pushers and drug addicts. And there were children and there were women. Women selling drugs for money and children being used to push drugs. And then children also becoming abusers. So drugs, slum and big money. So these are some of the clippings I have for you, which will show you basically what is reality and how media was reporting. What did I do? I started to work with these women and these children as a police officer. Now they were not. I can't help it if the government doesn't wake up. I can't wait. People can't wait. Children can't wait. You've got to act. So I started to. These are the places donated by people, and I put in places vocational training centers for women. Because when I started to threaten them to arrest them, they said, "Ma'am, we're willing to go along with you. Give us an alternative livelihood." So I brought in the community to bring in stitching and tailoring classes for them, and this is how a process began. Almost 24 to 20. How many years ago? It started in 1986. And I'm going to show you. And by the way, this space was donated by people. It was belonged to a drug pusher and a drug trafficker who ran away knowing he's going to get arrested. So this is how I use this space most optimally. This is the same place. You see a woman dancing amongst these children. She was an erstwhile drug peddler and been arrested by my predecessors scores of times. Every time she got arrested, she now needed money for the lawyer. So she re-offended, again paid, came out on bail, and then sold again and took chances, as they do take chances. But she was... So I tried to check this recycling of crime, police, case, jail, bail, lawyers, back to police, and back to a reoffending. It was a reoffending negative cycle. We decided to break these cycles, my friends. And this is a story of this woman. This is 1987, of the same slums. We needed to bring children, so we started schools for children. Now, as a police officer, because there were no treatment centers, I offered 8 premises of my police stations as drug abuse treatment centers. I never realized at that time that if somebody would die in my police station, I would be sacked. It just didn't even occur, because I believed all good will happen. So even if it's idealistic, I'm only telling you a case study. Whether it's replicable or not is not the issue. Issue is the spirit behind prevention. You see me in uniform right now, here. It's removing, that's how we started using some of our open ground premises as drug abuse treatment. It was holding places. I'm not looking at the scientific techniques. I'm looking at holding places where these addicts, when they were free, they would commit crimes. Now these became holding places where the mothers brought these sons to our police station. Imagine, they brought them to the police station. And what did we do? We started to work with them. We used the Indian yoga technique. And we used spirituality. You're very right. And I couldn't send them yet. Those days, we didn't even have the law to send drug addicts to the prison. So we did. So this is how the media started to report. New hope for drug addicts. Nav Jyoti was an organization which was born, and it's still a very strong foundation, celebrating 25 years next year. And started to run treatment. We finally consolidated. We moved out of police stations and set up our own treatment center. And we started to have more membership coming in. volunteers through yoga, through doctors, through homeopathy, through counseling, through psychiatry, all that, and food used to come from home. So we connected with the parents, saying, parents bring home, and parents also understand what is the cause of their problem of drug abuse, when are they breaking down in their homes, what's wrong with their father or the mother, having even alcoholic fathers at home. So this is how an organization was born called Navjyoti. So Navjyoti leads them to life. It became a strong hit in India those days when I was doing this kind of experimentation. But friends, government had not still pitched in. It was still a community police effort. But it was a combined police community effort. Now, if I say government didn't step in, I would say government did, because I was part of the government. And the government didn't hold me back from doing it. I had some very fine senior police officers who now became a part of the foundation. It was the first time a police foundation headed by the Delhi Police Commissioner, we founded a foundation of which I became a founding general secretary. These are treatments which are going on, and these are hospital, indoor, and they were all indoor for 6 months to 3 months. We were working with them. It brought my crime down 50%. Because now these were holding places and they were getting dry cleans to an extent. And you're very right, sir. It is not just a pharmacological recovery. It is biological, it's psychological, it's sociological, it's criminological. It's a very holistic recovery these people need. And that is where these people started to get in our in-house program. So they said, de-addiction, the police started. And they started saying, cops on a noble mission. And we started getting a lot of appreciation from people and a lot of support. And the yoga, as I told you, we used the yoga way to a drug-free life. It started to work. Yoga worked, whether it was physical asanas or whether it was spiritual, it was mantras, it was bringing the prayer, it was 12 steps came much later. But we started to use the Indian way. Whatever is culturally immediately acceptable, why not? Why not use what is straight away right under your nose? And this is how the foundation was born. And if you see the cops, these are two, my police commissioner, the founder and the successor. And we start to have these celebrations. And it survived. The program survived for years and years. But then, as I said, I'm a police officer. A foundation was born, now which grew with me in my career for 25 years. It still is there, by the way. It's growing stronger and stronger by the day. But along with it, I now moved from policing to Narcotics Control Bureau. And now it was traffickers' interdiction. So I started to go around destroying poppy fields. It's a lot of poppy fields which grow the heroin with the poppy flower and the heroin. So I was now into interdiction, drug traffickers at a national scale. So on one hand, I was working on demand-supply check. On the other hand, now I got an experience of supply check. So I started to now look at the other side. So this was one of those poppy fields. Then I went into public campaigns, my friends, spreading awareness amongst. So this became a part of my life, goes on till now. Then, my friends, from a police officer in prevention, police officer in detection, I got an opportunity to run a prison. No police officer normally goes into a prison assignment. I did. And now, I looked at it from the rehab point of view. So what I'm presenting before you is a concept of holistic approach to drug abuse prevention. And the key is where I believe, and having run a prison, having been an NGO, having been a police officer. By the way, I got my PhD also. I did get an honorary degree, but I also got an earned degree. And that was drug abuse and domestic violence from one of the top institutions of Delhi called the Indian Institute of Technology. And my PhD thesis was drug abuse and domestic violence. So imagine, it is just all about all drugs here, whether it's a police officer, whether it's a community officer, whether it was a prison officer, or whether it was a narcotics officer. So I looked at it from all 4 dimensions and saw something seriously missing. When I entered the prison, ran the prison program, I found almost 1 in 3 entering were drug addicts. Their problem was drugs. Crime and drugs were interrelated. Now, I wanted to research whether crime comes first or drugs come first. But believe me, my prison colleague didn't let me take the data. he didn't just respond. I don't know why. He just didn't respond. So I had to move from domestic to drug abuse and crime relationship, which I looked at from domestic violence relationship. But I found that almost 1 in 3 were drug addicts, and there were no adequate holistic treatment inside the prison. Now, as a police officer, I felt cheated, because every time I was sending a criminal or an offender inside, criminal later, offender inside, that means if he was not an addict, he was coming out contaminated. That means one more added, which means that when you are working outside, but your prison is not on your side, and your rehab inside the prison is not with you, you are losing all that investment which you could have made outside by sending him to a contaminated institution called the prison. So this is where I saw, and I set up now drug abuse treatments inside the prison. This was a social welfare minister. He immediately responded to my call, and he came and expanded the de-addiction facilities inside the Indian prison. So we began by the strategy of isolating addicts. When I visited the prison, there was like a human zoo, because all of them were having withdrawal symptoms at night, and there were cat calls, and they were not letting the person sleep. But once we started to isolate, we started to work with them at the entry stage, treatment, holistic, treating them in such a way they do sleep at night, and the rest of the prison could sleep. The rehab program inside the prison began. The program of crime prevention. So, but how do I check that all that I'm saying is happening? So I set up a program called Feedback Box. It was a box which would be touching every prisoner to write a letter to me, what's going on. This is a very simple box. It cost me less than $1, and I just fabricated it, locked it up, had the key with me, called the petition box, called the suggestion box, called the communication box. And each prisoner, and I had 10,000 of them. I was Inspector General of Prison for 10,000 prisoners, and 9,700 were men. Rest of them were only women. The first time ever, probably the world, in the developing world or a democratic world or a liberal democracy, a male prison for the first time was led by a woman. Shortest to all of them. That's how, but the feedback box was a total magic, because the message to all the prisoners were, write to me. Tell me what's going on. Who's consuming drugs? Who's selling drugs? Where is it coming from? And friends, you won't believe it, we made it a no smoking zone. Because the silver foil of the cigarette helps you chase the drug. So when I took away the cigarettes from the canteen, I tell you the chasing stopped. And now the little smoke would now get detected by the prisoners, and I would get the information. So I made it a no smoking zone, a drug-free zone, through this kind of program called the Feedback Box. Very simple, very absolutely free of cost, but very powerful, very communicative. And the strength of this country is meditation. This is not Hindu, this is not Muslim, this is not Christian, this is not Sikh. It was watching your breath, it was mindfulness. So I introduced the concept of mindfulness and helping them handle their withdrawals and even their other crime tendencies. This is a de-addiction drive, and I said, I'm going to show you, this is the whole chapter in this book, called It's Always Possible. I have only few copies of these. I brought them as a personal baggage, and they are lying outside. It has a chapter on how I addressed drug abuse inside the prison. It's a page of that book. It's a strategy of that. I have another book on how did I do the policing angle. It's called I Dare. This will give you a bit of police and a bit of prisons and the community as well. This is it as another book which I brought in. I have you got them, about individual stories, whereas an NGO, how we handled it as a family counseling center. So I brought in a range of personal insights of how these problems are handled either at the police level or at the prisons level or at the community level. So this is a page which I can't describe, but I'm finishing. But I must tell you, all this work brought me a link with the Nordic countries. This is an award from the IOGT I got as, you see how old it is? It shows the age. I got this in 1990 from the Norwegians, the IOGT. You were still there at that time. And they gave me an award for it. I don't know how they got to know what I was doing, but they came all the way from Oslo and came to give me this award called the IOGT. It's called the Asia Region Award in Drug Abuse Prevention. This was a turning point in policing, because after you gave me the award, what I was doing became a case study in the National Police Academy. Then it brought me the Asian Nobel Peace Prize. It is now a part of that recognition called the Magsaysay Award. And it says, observing the link between drug addiction and chronic criminality, Bedi set up community-supported detoxification clinics, a model she later developed for wider applications as the Deputy Director of the Narcotics Control Bureau. I thought I never worked for awards, but somehow or the other, they made it this far. But I thought I would just let you know how international community started to fly in, look at the programs, research, and then recognize. But what helped me is that Police Academy and my colleagues started to recognize and respect and got the program much more community support. And then I took it to the police. How could I not? Because they are the ones highly stressed, and some of them have serious personal problems which never surface. And then the United Nations Award came, the Serge Soter Award. I thought this is the highest award that my foundation could get. And that's it. All I would say as a summary is I'm talking about a holistic approach. Unless we create systems where we bring together on a regular basis, the criminal justice system and the policymakers. And in the criminal justice system is police, the prosecutor, the judiciary, the investigators, community, even the media is a part of the criminal justice. Because unless you look at them as a whole, criminal justice system strictly would be the police, the prosecutions, and the judiciary. And then policymakers with it, the politicians, another P. I think that alone would be have final results. Otherwise, individual efforts will give us individual results. But if we want holistic results, then we need to work together holistically. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kiran. That was so insightful, and what a visionary. Now I have great pleasure in introducing Bertha Madras, who may be known to many of you already, Professor of Psychobiology at Harvard Medical School and Associate Director for Public Education in the Division of Addictions. She served as Deputy Director of Demand Reduction in the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy following unanimous Senate confirmation from 2006 to 2008. She advocated for a public health approach to prevent, intervene, and treat illicit prescription drug use. There is much more about Bertha, but I think we'll let her share with you her insightful paper today.
Betty, I'm very, very touched by your comments and by your experiences, and I must say you're a hard act to follow. My experiences are not that different from Betty's in many ways, because I have served in many capacities as an educator, as a public policy official, and as an academic. And I must say that the ivory tower of academia bears no relationship whatsoever to the real world. When I was recruited into the ONDCP office, I never expected or anticipated the kind of experiences that I would see and meet people of the kind that I would meet. At one point I did grand rounds in a unit, a psychiatric unit in Washington, D.C., where social workers with their own private cars would drive around some of the worst parts of Washington By worst, I mean the most poverty-stricken and drug-ridden, and look for their patients, their psychiatric patients, who had not only schizophrenia, but HIV/AIDS, and they were too sick and too hopeless to take their medications. So they'd lift them off the streets, they'd put them into the cars, they'd bring them to the hospital, they'd give them an IV saline in order to hydrate them, give them their medications, and give them methadone if they merited it, and then put them back on the street because there was no other place for them. I once met a father who wept with me for ages, for hours and hours, and I couldn't understand why he was crying. He just leaned on my shoulder and cried, and I wondered, you have a story to tell, so tell the story. Get it off your chest so that we can try to discuss what you and I can do together and move towards something positive. And he said that he was stoned on marijuana and he was babysitting his 2-year-old daughter. And while he was babysitting her, she got stuck in 2 pillows of the sofa and suffocated to death in front of his eyes. And he was too intoxicated to realize that his own child was dying in front of him. And he decided to spend the rest of his life trying to alleviate the burden of this disease, of this affliction. So I've met many people from many walks of life. And yes, Betty, I was in a prison opening the first methamphetamine treatment prison in Illinois. And I did the most deliciously impolitic praise of Governor Rod Blagojevich, who subsequently has been arrested and put in jail, but he did have the wisdom and foresight to create a methamphetamine clinic in his prisons. What I'm going to speak to you about today is a very solemn issue. It's an issue about the future. It's an issue about our young children. And this afternoon I'll give a far more detailed description of what I'm going to try to convey to you. But this morning I will try just to give a very brief overview on youth and drugs. Drug use is ubiquitous, it's worldwide now. Bob Dupont summarized some of the reasons. The reasons are very simple. The modern era has been able to convert drugs, plants, into chemicals that are powerful, convert them into substances that you can administer through routes that never before were used. People would smoke opium, but they would never inject it IV. They would smoke tobacco, they would smoke marijuana, but with the advent of powdered and crystallized forms of many of these compounds and designer drugs, we now have epidemics, marketing systems, and business models that never existed in our history. Our early history in the US, cocaine was in Coca-Cola. People would sell little packs of morphine and cocaine for personal consumption. And now we have massive marketing of a number of drugs. The views of the United States have always gone into rhythms. Rhythms of permissiveness and rhythms of hardline antagonism towards drugs. And those rhythms depend on how public perceives and what the evidence begins to show with regard to drugs. In the 19th century, we had an epidemic, an horrific epidemic of heroin and cocaine use. And because of that, because of the consequences, when the public became aware that these drugs are causing so much harm in our populations, that is when laws began to be incorporated into our legal system, and international laws were formed as well. So that the Food and Drug Act, which was implemented in 1906, which gave rise to the Food and Drug Administration, which has protected the safety of our pharmaceuticals now for nearly a century, was implemented because of public awareness that drugs are malevolent to society and cause dreadful harm. So in 1981, Time magazine had this wonderful cover of cocaine powder in a cocktail glass. Because it was glamorous to use, lawyers and physicians and academics and businessmen and Wall Street brokers were using cocaine at parties, and bang, Len Bias died of a cocaine overdose, and a number of other events where people lost their mansions on Long Island. And suddenly, in 1986, within 5 years, society changed their views on drugs, and suddenly the drugs became the enemy within. And then within a decade, there was this, probably the ugliest cover I've ever seen on Time magazine, on how addiction can take over your brain through the reward system. And then we moved into 2007, where alcohol was now incorporated into the sense that drugs must include alcohol as an addictive form of substance. And 2010, Time magazine again records our society, calling it a marijuana because of the growing use and normalization of marijuana use. So we begin with plants, because human beings are voyagers and they're explorers. And throughout the course of our history, we have explored food. Food is the ultimate reward because it enables us to stay alive. But in the course of these explorations, we uncovered plants that not only provide sustenance, but some of them stimulate mildly, like nicotine, like caffeine, and some of them stimulate a bit more robustly, like chewing coca leaves in the high Andean mountains. And marijuana, which was psychoactive and known for more than centuries, also with regard to some of its other properties. And of course opium, which is recorded possibly in the Odyssey and the Iliad, and by Herodotus as well, as a plant that enabled people to go to sleep and be a very effective painkiller. But with the advent of modern chemistry, we isolated the active ingredients, we crystallized them, and we were able to produce them in forms that are so powerful that they can enter the brain rapidly, they have rapid access, and the quicker a drug gets into the brain, the higher the concentration gets into the brain, the more addictive it is. And so at first we end up with a psychoactive property that makes people feel good or makes them feel better. There are multiple reasons why people use drugs. And then come the adverse consequences. And the adverse consequences can be psychological, they can be physical, they can be miserable. So what I would like to do is quickly summarize some of our unpleasant truths that currently exist in the United States. And as the United States is a harbinger of what happens in the rest of the world at times, both good and bad, this is a cautionary tale for many of us. Also, what we can do about it. And one of the things that I have done while I was serving in Washington was become aware of the multifactorial ways in which we can promote a reduction in this public health challenge. One of the ways, obviously, is to medicalize it, because the white coat syndrome, walking into a physician's office, and that physician is able to tell you that this is not good for your health, can have an enormous impact on whether or not a person will or will not use drugs. And so that whole program, which I won't describe at all, became a very important part of my portfolio and my energy while I served in Washington. But during that time, I always felt that there's another piece of my life which was going relatively unfulfilled because there was neither time nor a venue for it. And that is that every time I spoke to the public about drugs, I always incorporated the science of drugs into the public. And every time I did, people would come up and say, we need your slides, we need your help, we have to bring this into the community. And that brought me a sense of awareness that there is a thirst, there is a hunger for this kind of scientific information that could help enormously. And we don't mean, it's not only for the most educated, the people who want to understand synaptic transmission in the brain and all these complex terminologies that for the vast majority of us are quite irrelevant to the issue. But people want to know the truth about drugs in a frank, objective way. What do they do? What can I tell my children? What do I know? What do I do not know? How can I help at the most fundamental level within a family, within a household? What can I learn and what do I not know? And I think that this form of prevention is critical for our society, and it has been completely underexplored and unused and unexploited. And that is probably one of the most important things that I will do for a few years in the coming days. The unpleasant truths are, for example, as Bob DuPont has so eloquently said, we now have 9 billion opioid pills prescribed for every man, woman, and child in the United States each year. That's 30 pills for every man, woman, and child. That is a legal prescription drug. And yet the diversion of that legal prescription drug involves no crime. More than 60% get it free from friends and family, and the death rates are mounting in parallel with the availability of these drugs. The unpleasant truths are that the mortality rates amongst people who use drugs, this publication just came out a few weeks ago, and it's a stunning piece of information. For cocaine, for alcohol, for marijuana, for methamphetamine, for opioids, the death rate is much higher than people who do not use these drugs. This is a huge database. It's over 70,000 people. And the people who did this analysis of national survey data are some of the finest epidemiologists we have. So the data is quite trustworthy. And they couldn't figure it out. They said, why is marijuana there? It's supposed to be non-lethal. And yet the death rate where marijuana is the primary cause of a substance use disorder is considerably higher than the rest of the population. The chilling statistics on medical use. People who use drugs and with substance use disorders have much higher propensity to have medical conditions, some of which are related to the drugs and some which are unrelated to the drugs. And then we come to parents. This is one of the most untapped sources of individuals in our society that we should be relying on, and we should be educating, and we should be recruiting to help us. And yet, parents, certainly in our nation, are quite ineffective and ineffectual. Risk factors. How many parents know that attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a high risk factor for drug use? That personality disorders in their children is a high risk factor for drug use? That first-degree relatives of alcoholism or drug addiction are very high risk factors for the children to use drugs. Poor grades at school, a very high risk factor for children to use drugs. If parents knew this when a child is 5 and they were conscientious, they would begin to exert much greater vigilance with their children than if they are completely unaware that these are risk factors, and yet the majority of parents are completely unaware that these are risk factors for their children. We have some good news. We have some bad news. The good news is that alcohol and tobacco is declining among youth. The bad news is that illegal drugs, primarily marijuana, is increasing very rapidly. From 2008 to 2012, the increase has been almost 80% in terms of heavy use. And how many parents are aware that kids who have substance use disorders also have a much higher incidence of medical conditions than kids who do not? Why is it that this kind of information is not being transferred to parents? They have much more injuries, higher levels of poisoning, and terrible sleep disorders compared to children who do not use. What should parents know? They should know these risk factors. They should also know that if there is psychological or physical or sexual abuse at home, their children are much more likely to use. They should know that if their physical environment is dangerous for the child is much more likely to use. They should know that if there are a lot of fights at home, there's a lot of conflict or parental neglect, the child is much more likely to use. If they should know, and all of this is evidence-based, every statement here is not my own impressions, these are all research-based, that if marijuana is legalized or the medical uses for marijuana in quotations are approved off either through ballot or state initiatives, that these states have much higher use rates. When parents were asked, they didn't believe it. And why are they voting yes on ballots when they should be aware that this could increase the risks to their children? They feel that they can't make a difference in their child's use, and yet evidence shows that kids whose parents say that drug use is not good and I don't want you to use, their use rate is about 5%. If parents don't make a strong stand, the use rate is 35%, 7 times higher. How many parents are aware of this differential in use? How many? And social networking, 5 times higher for kids who spend a lot of time on social networking. Parents can do an enormous amount with regard to reducing drug use in their children. They make clear statements. If they help with their child's homework, drug use is half. If they set clear limits on their child's behavior, on monitoring, on vigilance, drug use is half in those families. If they guard prescription drugs at home, diversion of prescription drugs for psychoactive purposes is reduced. We also should know, and this is the most important message that I'll be giving in the afternoon talk, that children are much, much, much more susceptible to becoming addicted to drugs than adults, by a factor of 5 or 6 times higher. With regard to alcohol, with regard to marijuana, with regard to almost every other drug that we use for psychoactive purposes. What parents should know is that the risks are true for nicotine, alcohol, inhalants, stimulants, cocaine, opioids, hallucinogens, and anxiolytics. And there are many factors. We can go into this afternoon. This is a list. I won't go through it for purposes of time, but the NIDA website gave a single day for young people to call in and ask their questions. And the questions were an insight into how little children know about drugs, how little education has penetrated our society in terms of why are drugs addictive, are some drugs more addictive than others, are there risks to a child, all these questions. So how can nations respond? The power of drugs can be surmounted, it can be supplanted, it can be suppressed if the teens get knowledge that they do not have access to, if parents get knowledge and help their children, and above all, if the knowledge becomes available and it penetrates every sector of society. I thank you very much.
Bertha, Dr. Madras. We'll hear more this afternoon. I now have great pleasure in inviting to the podium Gregor Burkhart, MD, and he is the Senior Scientific Analyst for EMCDDA. Gregor, since 1996, has been responsible for prevention responses at the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction. He developed databases on best practice examples, on evaluation tools, and prevention and evaluation resource kit, and the recently published prevention profiles on the EMCDDA website. We look very much forward to your presentation. Give Gregor a welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for this invitation to this favorite city of mine in Europe. Recently, we have seen that even prevention has been affected by the ideological divide in drug policy. People from the harm reduction side say that prevention is nothing than an expression of prohibition, and the others say that prevention should only focus on abstinence. And I try to provide a view on prevention that might reconcile all positions in a newer view. Prevention and hospitalization. I need to go first. I'm from Lisbon, and we are sitting in that city, and here all data from 27 member states plus 3 others come together on drug use, epidemiology, treatment responses, purity of drugs, and so on. All member states send us the data. Now, the big problem of prevention lately, and this is for both fields, right, for the people that advocate harm reduction and the others that do prevention, is maybe best exemplified by the statement of the UK Advisory Council for the Misuse of Drugs. They were saying some 4 years ago that there is weak evidence for prevention programs. So they should be kind of abandoned. What they're doing now, they're actually able to read since April. And they propose a little bit, what we know since the 70s, that it's not very much effective. Kind of providing just information about the hazards of alcohol, drug, and other substances to young people. This has led, not only this, but also our propensity to use information only to young people as prevention source, that many of our prevention interventions in Europe are mostly about information. I have many of these maps, you get them online on our website. The darker a country is, the more they use this kind of approach for prevention. And I have 3 others, kind of information-based at school, all they're just informing young people. But this has one big flaw. I'm talking now about neurobiology. Again, we have the brain here. The prefrontal cortex is basically the control organ of the brain, the ultimately human part of our brain. It makes us control our impulses, makes us emotionally intelligent, kind of inhibits the impulses to not to punch somebody in the face I don't like, but to smile in a conference. All these things are very important. But we have down in the very colored parts the limbic system, where is one important part, the nucleus accumbens. Now the funny thing in adolescence is that nucleus accumbens, where drive, motivation, impulses are sitting, begins to fire like hell when young people get 14 or 13. So they get a lot of drive, much more drive, like to put a stronger motor in a car. But then the prefrontal cortex is not mature yet. It only maturates totally when you're 26. So you have a situation which makes adolescents different from all kind of people, also different from kids, because they have a strong motor without brakes in the car. Normally, it doesn't make a big difference. If you put young people in a driving simulation test and ask them to take decisions on difficult driving traffic situations, they take good risk assessment, rational risk assessment, take the same good decisions as an adult would do about difficult traffic situations. So they go along quite well, but there is another effect. Remember oxytocin. The girls remember it's the hormone that goes up when they give birth. What few people know is that it also goes up in the fathers if the baby is close to them. Like this very eccentric Portuguese friend of mine who got soft like a lamb when the baby was put on his arm. And it depends if they're close to it, oxytocin goes high. So oxytocin is held as that hormone that makes people empathic, warm, bonding, so avoids being competitive, avoid being the aggressive alpha male. It makes people more sociable. And the funny thing is that also in the same period, the receptors for oxytocin in the brain increase a lot during adolescence. So they want to bond. And as you just said, there's an overlap of this arousal system, the social arousal system, with the reward system that has just been mentioned. So this makes that young people want to bond, want to be equal in how they dress, how they speak, how they behave, their norms, everything with their peers. This was in the 30s like that, and it's now still like that. And now if we do repeat the same driving simulation test with young people, and put another young person beside who doesn't say a word, Still, the whole driving test goes totally mad. They do decisions which are utterly stupid, and which would lead in a real-life situation to totally disastrous accidents. So we have a completely other view of peer pressure. Peer pressure is not that the bad friends of my innocent little boy are talking him into doing nonsense. No, it's the mere presence, the presence of other kids around, that makes that they take only stupid decisions. That's why Steinberg, who found out very recently this mechanism, said that young people should not be allowed to drive alone with other adolescents in a car. They should only drive totally alone, or an adult should be present. Because most accidents of young male happen when other adolescents are in the car. So it gives us a realistic view of what adolescents are and how they're different. Impulsivity, due to lupus accumbens, risk-seeking, the same thing, affective, intensive, peer-oriented social primacy, because of the oxytocin. This is important, we have to be realistic, we can't change that. And we will also be realistic, this is the kind of male the young girls like most, before they're 25, when they change their priorities. This is basically what gives you also a lot of sexual advantages. Now, the computer is quite important. First, if we know that people are doing things, more stupid things if they are together, can we hold them responsible for this impulsiveness? There was recently a case in Brazil where some nice upper-class boys burned an old Indian alive in Brasilia. It was the same thing. None of them would have done it if they would have been alone. It was just the thing of being together. So, this information provision on which we basing much of our approaches for young people is good in low-risk situations. When you're alone, when I can decide, or when I'm privileged. For example, when I'm a girl. Girls have a much better impulse control than boys. Or if I'm biologically better controlled, generally, then it's okay. But it also shows us the importance of perceived normality. I show an example of one of the worst mass media campaigns I've seen lately. But the Spanish government is so proud about it that they even published it in English and in their other national languages. It is done by the alcohol industry. And it seems quite nice, preventive. But look at this. It talks about the norm. So the young people, a 13-year-old girl would read, well, I'm not normal. First, the whole thing is epidemiologically stupid. It's not true, that is the norm, it's made. But a 13-year-old girl would say, I'm not normal. I haven't slept while drunk with an unknown. And then comes below the thing, greasy, but it shouldn't be the norm, in smaller letters. And then below the conclusion, talk to them. So it exemplifies again what is the danger of some mass media campaigns. Remember the famous American mass media campaign about cannabis to increase the use specifically in innocent people that hadn't heard about cannabis because it increased the perception of normality of use. And it gives us also the importance of social norms. There were they want to go. And this is something which is very in pro of Nordic approaches. So instead of talking to people and informing them, young people let's say, it makes more sense scaffolding. To put them in a situation where the context is so protective that their propensity of doing nonsense does less harm. Change the physical environment, economic, social, virtual, which means price of alcohol, availability of substances, acceptance of use, injunctive norms, and so on. Instead of allowing this kind of promotion. Now, in such a situation, even the most innocent boy would go into binge drinking, if it's a competition among alpha males, isn't it? So, we have now different levels of environment. Some have been mentioned already by Bertha. We have the classical macro environment. For you, Scandinavians, it's quite normal. You have limitation in buying age, price and tax of alcohol. We have enormous studies on tobacco. For Scandinavians and for Americans, it's normal. For Europeans, have to be convinced about it. They don't know it. It's highly effective. But we have also the meso level. Smaller contexts, which are physical contexts, which are important. We have the importance of rules and climate at school. It is so effective as school programs. Several studies also in Europe. The physical presence of cannabis in schools is a strong predictor of consumption in the same schools. The outlet density, who can sell the alcohol or not. When there are strange situations in the rest of you. And we have also microenvironment. Robert has already mentioned the simple thing. There's a big difference if I have drinking rules in family. This is highly effective. Simple rules. We don't, and so on. versus talking about alcohol. Talking about alcohol has the effect that they drink more. Recent studies, several studies from another group. So it's more important to have rules in the family than befriend and talk a lot about alcohol. Also the thing about pocket money. Pocket money is a predictor. Now that Spain has entered into recession, consumption initiation into drug use has gone down because we do not have anymore so much excessive pocket money. And here another example. The simple thing, how often you go out in a disco and what is your drug use? It's just the more you go out simply into discos, the higher you have use of several drugs. And what is it that makes it? What are the factors that contribute to that? Two studies, one American, the other European. It is simply the context of it. See, these are context factors. The biological researchers, the psychologists call this affordances. It makes a lot of difference if you're in a place like that, loud music, and you are served a big glass which you cannot put down on the table. What do? You cannot talk, you cannot put it down, you drink it up and you drink more and more of them, especially because it's cheap. It's different than you sit in a nicer place where there's ambience music, where you can talk slowly, you can put your little glass down on the table, sip on it while you flirt with somebody. It's totally different, you would drink less and you're that propensity. So changing context, and you see all this is unconscious. It's not about cognitive processes. We do all this without realizing it. The industry knows it, we don't. So this is classical. What works in these settings are those things. It's not providing leaflets about how to best use drugs or how to not use them. Because in such a context, people wouldn't listen to that if everybody is in a fun situation. What is most effective on recreational settings is suspends the license if the industry doesn't cooperate with the municipality, police, or prevention services. This is very important. So, in order to get drug use down in recreational settings, help with alcohol, that's the key part. And here I think the Nordics have to teach something to the rest of Europe. As you see here, it's a very low activity in the relevant regions. Look, half of member states don't even report on what they are doing in recreational settings. 11 even don't have, only 11 have free water provision in discos and clubs. The rest, in Spain for instance, they screw off the taps, so people cannot drink tap water from the toilets. They have to buy it, which they don't, obviously. And then only these countries here target alcohol in recreational settings. These countries have these coalitions between prevention and industries. And also a little bit in Catalonia, as the only region in Spain that has it. But the big problems happen here in the south. Everybody with cheap flights goes to the big resorts in the south of Europe, so all the British get drunk, classically Ibiza. And there, even the most innocent British get initiated often in Ibiza. Those who have maybe once a month ecstasy have it twice a day in Ibiza, and it diffuses British drinking patterns into South Europe. Spain has nowadays not anymore, at least Spanish youth have nowadays not anymore Mediterranean consumption patterns. They drink like the British. So, but now you ask, I'm all the time talking about alcohol. What's the connection to illicit drugs? Cannabis has been declining in Europe, in the low prevalence country and also in the most problematic country on the very right. There's a clear decline in the very recent year, after 20 years of observation. Now, a colleague of mine has taken the same curves and indexed them on when did change the law, drug law. And you see, in the countries where the drug law got harsher and in the countries where the drug law got softer, nothing happened. The same. So it went up, and it continued to go up in Italy, it continued to go down in the United Kingdom. So what you do, if you make your drug policy harder or not harder, doesn't make a difference on, apparently, cannabis use in young people. Why? Maybe because it's a very different thing if you target individuals by penal law or if you have social norms. But what might have been an effect is maybe the connection to smoking. This is cannabis use, this is not cannabis problem. Cannabis use went down in both the US and in Europe, but it was preceded by a fall in cigarette smoking in both continents some years before. What? Okay, already. Okay. Well, This might have been due to that now, since that, all member states have some kind of a tobacco policy in place. Most countries have, except maybe Austria and Czech Republic. And we have also the connection of alcohol. Look, the connection of alcohol with cannabis and cocaine. The reddish ones is cannabis consumption in heavy alcohol users compared to general population. The blue one is cocaine consumption compared to the general population. It is much higher by context. It's not necessarily gateway theory, but it's the same people using these substances together in the same places. It's a question of context. So what is now the definition of environmental prevention? It is modify context instead of persuading. You have to see alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, and cocaine. It's connected. It doesn't make sense to make a division for prevention between licit and illicit drugs. And so, the focus should be on social norms that are determinants of initiation. This is a very Nordic thing. Maybe the simple fact that Sweden and the Nordics have less consumption is because they have much stronger norms against all kinds of substances. And you don't need to criminalize individuals. It's not effective, and it is not necessary. Young people in most inquiries say they don't care. They're not very much frightened by the level of penalty given to cannabis use or not. But you need to regulate the industries. So it is not the same thing as prohibition. It is important for a unified debate in Europe. It is just a question of regulation, which regulates the public life. It reduces the opportunity. It doesn't go into private life by penal code. And it has as modus operandi something which is much more powerful. It's the question of shame and public exposure. Also neurobiologically, this is much more important. People do not steal in supermarkets because they're afraid of the legal consequences of being caught. They do not steal because they're afraid of being publicly exposed when they are caught. It's the shame question. This is much more important. And another thing, also to explain the Swedish phenomenon, talking about environment. You know this famous book by Wilkinson, where they say that a lot of problems, social problems, among them mental illness and drug abuse, are related to social inequality. And you see, maybe it's the fact that Sweden is very low in that graph, and there's very few problems of that line, explains the low problem ratio in most of these countries and why the US and UK have higher rates, because they are way at the end of the civilized world in terms of social inequality. Now, the time is over, I stop here then. Very easy.
Well, as usual, another very provocative presentation, something for us to think about, and lots of information that will hopefully be on our website. Now, I have two delightful tasks to do just before we have lunch, and don't forget about the dinner tonight, 7 o'clock here, and it'll be not just dinner but some entertainment as well and a chance to network. You might feel tired, but it will rejuvenate you. So come back for dinner tonight. The other thing is membership of WFAD. Have a look on the website and see if you can, if you're not a member, think about joining. It's very simple. The third task to do is to give to our speakers a token of our esteemed appreciation for their presentations today. So for Kiran Bedi, for Gregor Burkhart, and for Bertha Madras, thank you very much. The rainforest hectares are again being It's a beautiful idea, isn't it? And one last thing, a very, very important announcement. I'm going to ask our colleague, Peter Rostad, to come to the podium just to tell us a little bit about another conference.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I promise to take up no more than 2 minutes of your time. First of all, may I express my thanks to the the World Federation Against Drugs for allowing me the opportunity to talk to you briefly about the upcoming International Council on Alcohol and Addictions Conference, which will take place in November in Montreal. Secondly, could I thank your chair, Josephine Foster, for her forbearance in allowing me to take up some time at the end of what was clearly a most enjoyable session. Briefly, the ICAA congresses, I'm sure many of you will know about ICAA, and you will know that these congresses take place annually. They take place in different locations throughout the world. They are inevitably exciting, they're interesting, and quite challenging. They are very multidisciplinary conferences. That they contain people who are practitioners and researchers and leading thinkers from throughout the world. They're based on plenaries, seminars and workshops, and they cover all aspects of addiction, because I think what was realised a long time ago is that most of us find ourselves dealing with cross-addiction of one sort or another, and that in many cases the experiences of working in whatever way with one form of addiction has quite considerable transferability to other aspects of addiction. We will look at everything from global policy through to new directions in treatment. The conference, as I've said, will take place between the 12th and 16th of November in Montreal, Canada. The title is Thinking Across Addictions, Acting Across Borders, and we will cover diverse topics ranging from internet gambling through to some very interesting papers that I know are going to be presented by some people who are attending this conference and will be presenting on drug policy in South America. We will have leading practitioners and academics drawn from all parts of the globe, including a number of contributors who you have already heard or will be here at this conference. There will be some 40 plenary keynote speakers addressing 20 different plenary sessions. And interestingly, acknowledging that people have different interests, we will be dividing each session into two, so there will be parallel plenaries. So, for example, if you're interested in gambling, it may well be that there will be a parallel session that is looking at drug addiction or alcohol problems. Of particular interest at this conference, and an interest I know that many of you have, will be the focus which we will have on alcohol issues. At the invitation of the World Health Organization, ICAA is currently looking at the NGO role in rolling out the implementation of the global alcohol policy. We are contacting NGOs worldwide and looking at what roles they are playing, what actions they have taken in the furtherance of this policy. And the information that we get will be presented at a special session in Montreal, to which the World Health Organization will be contributing and is looking at in great interest. The conference will take place in the Palais de Congrès in Montreal. It is very central. It's a very exciting and very interesting location. All the hotels are going to be within 10 minutes of the centre. For those of us, and I say us, who are interested in shopping, there is an amazing shopping centre in Montreal. And if it gets really cold, it is November, but if it gets really cold, you can get to all of these shops underground. It's incredibly clever. For any of you who are interested in jazz, I can seriously recommend some world-class jazz clubs to go and look at. The conference will be world-class. I hope we can actually achieve the standards that have been laid down by this conference, which certainly is a world-class conference. And I hope to welcome you in Montreal, because I know we all have a common aim of seeking to achieve a healthier and safer world. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Just before we actually go, there's been a very special request of a question of our last speaker, Gregor. I wonder if you wouldn't mind coming back to the podium. It's just that the plenary is an important time to share views, so if we could just have your indulgence for one question, and then there'll be a chance at lunchtime to catch up with the other speakers, because you may want to follow through on things with them as well. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Roxana. I'm building more late in the lunch. I'd like to My name is Roxana Stere. I'm coming from Romania and I'm guilty for delaying your lunch. I would like to address two short questions to the gentleman, taking the opportunity that he is here with us. And the two questions are very simple. I know that the European Monitoring Center addressed the issue of human rights, and I'm curious why they never address Article 33, Convention on Rights of the Child, the instrument that all EU member states are part of. And instead they address all the time the rights, the so-called human rights of the drug users. And the second question is how the concept of harm reduction indulged by the EU contains protecting drug users against laws that all of us ratified in an international forum.
And the last one, I understood the second one.
In your papers related to harm reduction, or what you indulge as a concept of harm reduction, even if it was never defined, EU papers are talking about protecting drug users against laws. This is an extremely interesting concept. I never encountered it in any other area. So why do you have laws if you have to protect the people who are using drugs against the laws? Thank you for answering.
I am the prevention guy, the monitoring center. I am totally innocent. There's nothing to do with all this what my colleagues are publishing. Maybe there's a nice monograph of harm reduction, but I think you shouldn't diabolize it so much.
May I say something? May I say something? To use this. I don't want to diabolize anything. I know that harm reduction does not function, and still I'm interested as a EU member state, coming from an EU member state, and as all of us ratified CRC, why do you talk about human rights and about drugs? And I never seen mentioned in any of your papers Article 33 CRC, never. I seen a lot of talk about the rights, human rights of drug users. This is still a criminal activity under the international law, 3 conventions, at least.
No, in Europe it's not. In some member states it's not. It's criminal law, and the law is not so much applied as it is. But you are targeting the wrong person.
It's like the United States is not applying the torture convention.
Exactly.
To ratify it.
Exactly. You didn't make reservations against it, so why you don't apply it? That's my question.
But why don't you ask the member states?
You're the first one.
No, I'm not the one. We are a
talk.
monitoring center. We are not doing policies. Maybe I should have spent the whole 10 first minutes of my talk about what we are and what we are not. We are not making policies.
I know that.
We are monitoring what member states are doing. If you have complaints from member states, go to the Commission
No,
and
I
have horizontal drug groups. It is not my issue of talking about what member states doing. Only one point about ineffectiveness of harm reduction. I mean, I thought I'd bring that slide with me. There's a quite nice slide about the spread of HIV within IDUs compared to the US, Russia, Eastern Europe, and Europe.
I'm coming from Eastern Europe, sir.
Yeah.
I know that.
And HIV rates are very closely related, inversely related to the number of people in substitution treatment. I mean, in the US it has much higher rates than we have. In Russia it goes out of the scale. And in Eastern Europe it's also much higher. It is inversely related to the number of people in substitution treatment. You cannot simply say it does not work. There's a fat monograph of 2,000 pages which is scientifically sound. It says it does work.
May I ask
But
you
it
a
doesn't
question?
contradict what I'm saying here. It does not contradict what you say.
Great. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Time for lunch.